What would we do without Sina? Thank you. So I do want to thank Sina for for spearheading tonight. We have a very exciting discussion tonight, a lecture tonight from Professor Moshe Halbertal. The last time that I was with the professor was in New York, in which I was honored to share a panel with him speaking about Rambam, Maimonides. It was a very interesting discussion. I learned a lot from what the professor shared, but most importantly, the reason why we actually ended up doing that panel was because a student of mine had asked me a year prior if he had to read one book on the Rambam, which one would I recommend? And I had just read Professor Halbertal's book on Rambam, and in my perspective, it was the greatest book on Rambam that I had read, and I had read a few. It was just absolutely remarkable. It treated everything with such clarity, with such depth, and such a clear presentation that I was so honored to be able to have the opportunity to sit with him. My student then arranged this panel, in New York with the professor. So before I introduce the professor and present the floor to him, and I'm not going to take too much time away from this, I do want to speak a bit about, to our guests and everyone who's here, what the Sephardi Habura is about, right? So this is a wonderful event that we're doing tonight, which is an example of many events that we will do, please God, in the future, and some that we've done in previous weeks, but it's relatively new, and it is essentially this. The S&P Sephardi community, the Spanish and Portuguese Sephardi community, recognizes that we are more than our culture. And in saying that, I mean, right, I'm the senior rabbi of the Spanish Portuguese Sephardi community. It's the oldest community in the United Kingdom. They were established in 1656, and there is so much culture and custom that is part of this community. And it is not the only aspect of the Sephardim, right? But it definitely stands as a symbol, as a pinnacle for the custom of the Sephardim that, frankly, is less and less heard in the world today. And so when people hear about the Sephardim, they think about food, they think about music, they think about Arabic culture, which is definitely part of it. But one of the aspects of the Sephardi world that is, in my opinion, becoming less and less heard are the ideas, the approach that is unique to the world, to Torah, and to our Judaism. And the point of the Sephardi Habura, ultimately what is a Bet Midrash Sephardi, is to be able to use our technology to present these ideas and to present this learning and to present this rich and deep historical heritage to the world, to anyone who wants to hear it. And so the lecture tonight from Professor Halbertal is a wonderful example of what it is that we want to present. Professor Halbertal has written many books. I'm going to say a bit about him before I turn the floor over to the professor. He is one of the leading Jewish academics in the world at this time. And he's the Gross Professor at NYU Law School, a professor of Jewish thought and philosophy at the Hebrew University, and a member of Israel's National Academy for Sciences and the Humanities. He has written many books, among them Idolatry, People of the Book, Canon, Meaning, and Authority, which was published by Harvard University Press. He wrote a book called On Sacrifice. And of course, as I mentioned, he wrote a book called Maimonides, Life and Thought. He has just written a book on Nachmanides. So we might know them as Harambam and Ramban. And I always say the Ramban Nachmani to differentiate. But the Rambam and the Ramban Nachmani, not just because their names are so similar, are looked at as two very opposing individuals or Hachamim in the Sephardi world. And they present two different approaches that are within the world of the Sephardi thought and approach. I recall the Ari, Rabbi Yitzhak Luri Ashkenazi. He writes about the two of them. And he says that they come from two opposite but parallel places in the heavens. Their souls were born in opposite but parallel places. But the Ramban, people think, was very much different or opposed from the Rambam, from Maimonides. But few people realize or know that the Ramban Nachmani himself wrote an Igeret. He wrote a letter in the defense of Harambam himself, one of the most beautiful defenses of the Rambam. But it is not my job tonight to speak about them. It is the professor's job to speak about them. And the professor has just written a book on Nachmanides, as I said. And so we are looking very forward to hearing the professor's presentation tonight about Harambam and Haramban and the differences between them and their approaches to Torah, and how ultimately they comprise a rich and meaningful world within the Sephardi thought and approach. They are, in no uncertain terms, the grandfathers, the ancestors of the Sephardi thought that we so treasure and prize today. Without further ado, Professor Halbertal, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Dweck, and it's an honor and pleasure to be here among you. And I really congratulate you for the Chabura. It's such a wonderful idea and worth exploring and developing. And yafutzu ma'inotchem achutza in a most wonderful way. It's kind of a renewal and a revival of a wonderful world that has to be explored, interpreted, made available. So, Ishar Koach.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to. This subject is so broad because, as Rabbi Dweck mentioned, Moshe ben Maimon and Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman are the two greatest halachists, one of the 12th century and one of the 13th century. Ramban was, when Rambam died in 1204, Ramban was around 8 or 9 years old, right? Ramban died in 1270. So, and they belong to Sepharad in general, but to two different places in Sepharad. Rambam, Moshe ben Maimon, born in Andalusia, in Cordoba. Ramban, Moshe ben Nachmanides, born and raised in Catalonia, in Girona, and then the great rabbi of Barcelona. So Ramban belongs to Christian Spain. Rambam belongs to Muslim Spain, Andalusia, and Catalonia. What makes them all both Sfaradim? It's a complex question that we're going to have to deal with. And I want to say something about Andalus. This is an historical observation. And then I will examine one aspect, one central aspect of the philosophy of Halacha of Moshe ben Nachman and the philosophy of Halacha of Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. Let me start with a historical observation. And it's very foundational to understand the world of the Sephardi world in the 13th century. The world of Andalus, Al-Andalus, that was part of Muslim Spain, where the major works of Arabic Jewish culture were produced in Arabic, in Judeo-Arabic. Bach Yair and Pakuda Chovat Alvavot, Kuzari of Rabbi Yehuda Levi, the works of Rabbi Shlomo Ibn Gabirol, Avraham ibn Ezra. These were all products of Andalus. Needless to say, the great poetry and other figures that emerged from Andalus. That world actually collapsed and was completely shattered and broken in around the middle of the 12th century, around 1150, 60. because of the emergence of radical Muslim movement called the Muhayyidun, which forced, among other things, forced Maimonides' family to flee from Andalus southward to Morocco, to Fez and other places. Then the Rambam the Rambam's family went through the Maghreb, through North Africa, reached at the end Egypt, and the Rambam stayed in Fustat next to Cairo. But that world of Andalus was shattered completely. There is no actually a genuine Jewish, Judeo-Arabic culture after that moment in Andalus. But and now we come to a very important moment in Ramban's, Moshe ben Nachman's life. There were family, as the Rambam's family, and this is something actually I never understood historically, and I don't know how anybody understands. The Rambam's family escaped from Andalus to North Africa, to Morocco, where the Muhayyidun actually emerged from Morocco, expanded to the north, to Andalus, and took over South Spain. And as if he went to the eye of the storm. They escaped to the eye of the storm. Maybe they had protection there, I'm not sure, but that's what the Rambam's family did. But many Andalusian Jews actually escaped across to the Pyrenees to Provence. And I want to talk about two Sephardi families, are very important in the history of Jewish thought. The family of Kimchi, right? Rabbi David Kimchi, Radak, the family, great interpreters of the Bible, and the Tibonim. Moshe, Shmuel Yehuda ibn Tibon, Shmuel ibn Tibon, great families of translators. They arrived to Provence, they crossed the Pyrenees and moved to a world of Jews in Ashkenaz that didn't know Arabic, didn't speak Arabic, didn't read Arabic. And they were engaged in a major translation of all Andalusian culture to Hebrew, the Tibonites. Right? The first, for example, translations of Chovot Alvavot and other works were done by Yehuda Tibon and others. And Provence, on the one hand, was the place where Kabbalah emerges. On the other hand, through the family of Ravad, Rabbi Yitzchak Sagi Naor, and other figures, and on the other hand, it's the place where migrants, the aristocracy of Andalus immigrates, very well received by the leading rabbinic families of the area. But this is the place where Ashkenaz and Sepharad meet, in Provence, in cities like Perpignan, Montpellier, and other places, Lunel. These are the cities where those cultures meet. This is why this is also the place where Jewish cultural wars were enacted. When Shmuel ibn Tibon and his students and followers, he translates the Guide of the Perplexed, he translates it, Moreh Nevuchim, he translates it in the request and expectation of rabbinic figures in Provence who are admirers of the Rambam, around the circle of Rabbi Yonatan Milunel. The translation reaches Provence, and there are fierce critiques of the Rambam. By the way, in 1232, a fierce battle, violent cultural war emerges around the Rambam's legacy in Provence. Why in Provence and not in Paris or in Barcelona or Toledo? Because Provence is the meeting place that the old Andalusian families, with their influence of reshaping Provençal Jewish culture, meeting the Ashkenazi world head-on. And you have, this is a moment in Jewish history, it's a very painful moment, where certain figures in the rabbinic world of Provence are trying to ban the study of Moreh Nevuchim, Sefer HaMada, other works of Maimonides. They're not succeeding that much. Then they call on for help from the Tosafists in northern France, and the Tosafists have no qualms, and they ban, including burn Sefer Hamada and Moreh Nevuchim. It's actually a fierce communal battle that involved also intervention of the Gentiles. Different forces try to intervene, etc., etc. We can give a whole few shiurim about the cultural war of medieval Jewry, but I'm trying to explain to you why it is in Provence, because Andalus at that time lives in Provence. That's where Andalus is. I mean, it moves a little bit to North Africa, that's true, Rambam. But a lot of the great families with great culture, moving from Sepharad to Ashkenaz to Provence. Here we come to Ramban. Moshe ben Nachman at the time was relatively young, in his late 30s. And he intervenes in the debate that is raging in Provence. He sits in Barcelona, has the whole Jewish culture actually gets to the Ramban. He knows everything. And he writes a letter to the Tosafists from Barcelona in defense of the Rambam's world. This letter is called Terem E'ene Ani Shogeg. Before I begin to write, I might be erring. It's kind of the great humility of Moshe ben Nachman. By the way, this letter put an end to the ban. And Rabbi Dweck mentioned it in his introduction. It's not an accident that he mentioned it. It's a seminal letter. I'm going to read you just to get the force of the letter and to get Nachmanides' cultural sensibility. I want to read you a verse that he said that Ramban mentioned in towards the French rabbis, and he writes to them the following: "V'im atem rabbanei Tzarfat, im atem meaning the Tosafists, bechek emuna amunim. You are within faith, residing within faith."
Why isn't it working in the hall?
Shtulim בחצרות הקבלה דשנים ורעננים. You are planted within the courtyards of tradition, דשנים ורעננים, secure and fresh, right? הלא תשימו לב ליושבי הקצוות. You should be aware of what's going on in the corners of the world that you don't know. כי ישיב לביצרון אסירי התקווה. Maimonides has freed the captives. ומוכחי התאוות השביעם באמונתנו וקבלתנו נפשות רבה. He has restored their faith, and then he says, Alachem גאוני התלמוד הצריח עצמו, did he address you? והוא כמוכרח ואנוס לבנות ספר מפני פילוסופי יוון שמה לנוס. לרחוק מעל אריסטו וגלינוס, השמעתם דבריהם אם טעיתם אחרי ראיותיהם? He asked them, are you aware of the cultural crisis that Maimonides is addressing in his world? Have you ever read Aristotle, Galenus? Do you know the sort of contribution Maimonides had to that world that was engaged with Greek philosophy and thought? So it basically writes them and says, what do you know about Rambam? You live in a completely different cultural space. So you have no way of assessing Rambam's contribution. right? It's a kind of, he writes to them and says, you're living in your own ghetto in some ways, you know, safe in your own walls of untouched tradition, and with no understanding of the Rambam's contribution. So we see a great defense of Ramban's world of the Rambam. But I want to say one thing. And for me, I don't want to talk about Sepharad in general because it's too broad of a category. I want to talk about Andalusia, and then we go to Castilla and Catalonia. Ramban was not part of the Andalusian culture for one very simple reason. He was a Kabbalist, a major figure of Kabbalah in the medieval period, a major. Read his Torah commentary. You come to a verse and he says, Al derech haemet, by way of truth, and the Ramban means Kabbalah. Kabbalah was not present in Andalus. I don't want to begin even to think what would have happened if Moshe ben Maimon, the Rambam, knew about the Kabbalists. I don't want to begin to think the sort of letters and his tone of approach towards them. Right. And the complete, by the way, we hear it from his students in Provence, the way they treat Kabbalah. Absolute hostility as a heresy within Jewish thought. So Ramban couldn't be part of that world. Now, clearly, the world of Andalus is a complex world. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and Maimonides don't have the same approach to Yahadut philosophically. Ibn Ezra is not the same like Rabbi Yehuda Halevi or the Rambam. But Kabbalah is not part of the world of Andalus. It's part of Spain, it's part of Sepharad, but not part of Judeo-Arabic culture at that time. The Zohar was maybe written, maybe discovered, whatever you say, in Castilla. But within, it's also Sepharad. Sepharad encompasses basically everything. But if we talk about the Judeo-Arabic culture of Andalus, Ramban is not part of that world in a deep way. But, and here I want to talk about one aspect, and then I'm stopping with introductions and large pictures and large claims, and I want to get into a detailed conversation of one dimension of Ramban's work. And I want to talk about halacha. Ramban lives in Barcelona, and he's aware of all medieval halacha. He knows what's happening among the Tosafists, Rashi, the Tosafists, Ravad, Zrachi Alevi, all the figures of France and Provence, all Ashkenazi halacha. But he has a very particular attachment and commitment to the Rif, Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi. In his work Milchamot Hashem and other works, Ramban's, if you read in his Chidushim, Chidusha Ramban on the Shas, and I'm sure some of you have encountered Chidusha Ramban on the Shas, right? Chidusha Ramban on the Shas made it the greatest interpretation on the Shas, on the Talmud ever written, in terms of analytic depth and philological care. Now, in his Chidushim, whenever he says Rabbeinu Agadol, our great teacher, Rabbeinu Agadol, it's interesting. Rabbeinu Agadol is always Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, the Rif. You have to remember, the Rif moves from North Africa, from Fez into Andalus, and he has a yeshiva in Lucina, and the great student and the heir of the Rif as the head of yeshiva in Andalus is Rabbi Yosef Halevi Ibn Migash, who is the teacher of Maimonides' father, Maimon. So here is a deep connection between Ramban and the Rambam, halachically speaking. There are Ramban, for whatever reasons, and this is a question we have to. Ramban has a deep connection to Andalusian halacha, to Sepharadi halacha. Sepharadi, I mean in the strict sense of Andalus, through his attachment to Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi. And the Rambam clearly is a product of that world of halacha. You know, the Rambam says, when the Rambam says Rabotai in Mishneh Torah, he means two figures, not his immediate teachers. He means the Rif, Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, and Ibn Migash. So we have two great figures, one a philosopher, one a Kabbalist. The great pillars of medieval Jewry. They have different theological approach, but halachically, when they speak about their teacher, stam teachers, they are referring to the Andalusian halachic tradition. The Rif is a central figure in their world. Now I want to introduce and hear something that is central to our conversation, which is the philosophy of halacha and their relationship to the Geonim. Rambam wrote the last work, among the last works of Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, Ramban, was his asagot, his commentary, his critique of Sefer HaMitzvot of the Rambam, asagot leSefer HaMitzvot of the Rambam. And in this asagot, in these annotations, the Ramban creates an argument, makes a strong argument against Rambam's philosophy of halacha. And I want to touch upon this issue of their approaches to philosophy of halacha. And it has to do with their relationship to the Geonim. I'm going to read the approach to halacha and to controversy as it was articulated in the Geonim's world. And this is a text written by another Andalusian figure, Avraham ibn Daoud, the author of Sefer Kabbalah, and he represents the view of the Geonim towards controversy, truth, and other aspects of philosophy of halacha. And I'm going to read and translate as we go along, and we'll talk about the foundations of this approach. He writes the following. זה ספר הקבלה, this book of tradition, כתבנו להודיע לתלמידים כי כל דברי רבותינו ז"ל, חכמי המשנה והתלמוד, כולם מקובלים, חכם גדול וצדיק מפי חכם גדול וצדיק, ראש ישיבה וסיעתו מפי ראש ישיבה וסיעתו. He says, by the way, I'm reading the Hebrew translation of the Arabic here, so I should have actually translated immediately to English. And he says, we've written this book of tradition is written to announce to the students that all the words of our teachers are all received. One scholar from another scholar, one Odeh Yeshiva from another Odeh Yeshiva, and etc. uleolam, it has been always the case that the rabbis of the Talmud, and even more so the rabbis of the Mishnah, even a small thing didn't renew from their own thinking. So all of halacha is tradition, received from Moshe Sinai, oral law, all of halacha. There is no innovation in the Talmud. It's all tradition. Now comes the question. V'im lachshecha adam. And now comes the question. And he says, and if someone claims to you, why is it that they have controversies? Why are there controversies? If everything is tradition, why are there controversies in the Talmud? Answer him, and here's the problem. If everything is tradition, received from Moshe, Sinai, all oral law, why are the controversies in the Talmud, in the Mishnah? And then he says the following. You should answer him the following way. שלא נחנקו רבותינו זיכרונם לברכה לעולם בעיקר מצווה אלא בתולדותיה. The rabbis never argue about the principle of a mitzvah, only about its details. ששמעו עיקרה מרבותם ולא שאלו על תולדותיה. They have heard the central issue from their teachers, but they have missed. They didn't ask about the details. כיוצא בו, מפני שלא שימשו כל צורכם. They weren't diligent enough. כיוצא בו, לא נחלקו אם מדליקים נר שבת אם לא, על מה נחלקו, במה מדליקים ובמה מדליקים. וכן, אם חייבים אנו לקרות קריאת שמע ערבי ושחרית אם לא, על מה נחלקו, ממתי קוראים את שמע בערבית וממתי קוראים את שמע בשחרית, וכן בכל דבריהם. He says the following. This is, by the way, the Gaonic view of controversy, prior to the Rambam. It says the following. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said everything to Moshe. When he said to him, B'shokvecha uvkumecha, he also detailed to Moshe Rabbeinu, he detailed not only the duty to recite the Shema, he detailed to him also the time of the recitation. And it was passed in tradition. But because it was passed in tradition, and because there were students who were not diligent enough, they forgot those details, and they began to argue. So controversy, according to this opinion, controversy of halacha, is an accident, a downfall from a prior harmonic, united starting point that was deteriorated through forgetfulness and lack of diligence among students. Right here, he reiterates the Talmudic source, משרבו תלמידי שמאי והלל שמו שימשו כל צורכם, נעשתה תורה כשתי תורה. By the way, this view, I want to say, if you look at the Gaonic view, and I'm going to call it the restorative view, has the following understanding of philosophy halacha. And Maimonides will challenge everything of it, every bit of it. Let's start with Revelation. Revelation was complete. Everything was said in Sinai. Controversy is a downfall of an harmonious, complete tradition that was distorted through lack of diligence of students. So there is a theory of controversy. There's also a theory of interpretation. Interpretation doesn't innovate anything. It's an attempt to restore lost knowledge. There is also a theory of truth, which is the following. Every time we have a controversy, one of the sides of the controversy is wrong, right? If you have an argument, ממתי קוראים את שמע בערבית, משעה שיקרצו הכהנים לאכול בתרומתם, עד סוף שמירה הראשונה, דברי רבי אליעזר, אחרים אומרים עד חצות. You have two opinions. One of them is wrong, because Hashem said at Sinai, one of those opinions, or maybe both are wrong. So you have a theory of truth. You also have a theory of authority, which is the earlier you are in time, the more authoritative you are. Why? You have better and fresher and more authentic knowledge of the whole before it was deteriorated in time. So you look at this philosophy of halacha, emerging from the Geonim, you have, as I said, a theory of revelation, a theory of controversy, a theory of interpretation, a theory of truth, and a theory of authority. Maimonides challenges all of them, and Nachmanides will challenge Maimonides, coming with a third position. Let's go to Rambam. Rambam writes his Perush HaMishnah in his introduction to Perush HaMishnah. It's very interesting. The first work that the Rambam wrote, a systematic work, Perush HaMishnah, his interpretation of Mishnah. You read the introduction. He's writing it when he's around 25 years old, something like that. In his 20s, mid-20s, late 20s. He writes an introduction to the Mishnah, and he begins to outline his philosophy of halacha. And in one section in the Perush, I'm going to read a section. He says, halacha, you can divide all of halacha into five. And he says, and then he says, the first element are those laws received from Hashem in Sinai to Moshe, orally, and these laws, there is no controversy. Whatever was received, there is no controversy about it. Then he comes, and then he says, there are laws, but you can find through interpretation proof to these laws that were given orally to Moshe. Then he says the second aspect of the law, it's not that important, the halachot leMoshe miSinai, laws of Moshe miSinai were given to Moshe via tradition, but nobody can find them through interpretation. Now comes the third dimension, it's very important. He says the following, החלק השלישי, the third aspect, הדינים שהוציאו על דרכי הסברה ונפלה בהם מחלוקת, ונפסק בהם הדין על פי הרוב. He says the third element of the law is those laws that were derived via interpretation, and in those laws that were derived via interpretation, controversy emerges. There was no tradition about them, and they were derived through interpretation, and controversy emerges. I want to say, I will continue. I'm continuing now Rambam's thought, quoting from Perush HaMishnah, אבל מי שיחשוב, whoever thinks שהדינים שנחלקים בהם, כמו כן מקובלים מפי משה, וחושבים שנפלה המחלוקת בדרך טעות ההלכות, או השכחה, או מפני שאחד מהם קיבל קבלת אמת והשני טעה בקבלתו או שכח, או שלא שמע רבו מכל מה שצריך לשמוע, ויביא ראיה על זה ממה שאמרו, משרבו תלמידי שמיים והלל שלוש מכל צורכם, רבתה המחלוקת בישראל ונעשתה תורה כשתי תורות. He said, whoever thinks that controversy is a result of a deterioration of tradition, that's the גאונim's view. דברים כאלה הם חי נפשי, דברים מגונים ומכוערים מאוד. These are reprehensible and ugly things to say. הוא פוגם באנשים אשר נתקבל ממנו המצוות, וכל זה שב ובטל. So let me recast Maimonides' position, and then we're going to go to Ramban's position, Nachmanides' position. According to Maimonides, revelation didn't include all of the law. It included only a kernel, a core. When God gave Torah to Moshe, he says to him, B'shochvecha, and he didn't give a detailed time orally. When does machloket appear? When the rabbis, when the chachamim begin to ask, what is the time of B'shochvecha, of Kriyat Shema? And they argue if B'shochvecha is when you go to sleep or while you're sleeping. Is it at the beginning of the evening or all night? Then controversy emerges. If there would have been a Kabbalah about it, a tradition about it, there wouldn't have been any controversy. Controversy begins with interpretation. So let me say, so there is the following. It challenges all aspects of Gaonic view. It's interesting. First of all, Revelation didn't include everything. One thing. Second, controversy is not a result of forgetting of tradition. It's a result of the entry of the human creative voice into Aloha. There controversy begins. Third, interpretation. Interpretation is not the attempt to restore old knowledge that was forgotten or lost, but interpretation is a creative act of adding new rules. Aloha accumulates through time, through innovative interpretations of the rabbis. Truth, fourth. Truth is not about whether you missed, in cases of controversy, truth is not about whether you missed what was said already in Sinai. Truth is about whether your interpretation coheres well with the psukim, with the premises provided by the Torah. For a fifth, authority. It's not the case that when you are earlier, you have more authority. Why? Because tradition always stays intact. There is no forgetting in tradition. Whatever was received in Sinai is kept with us as it was. So Maimonides challenges all aspects of Gaonic philosophy of Halacha. Revelation, controversy, interpretation, truth, and authority. By the way, what's the theological stake in the argument? And soon we're going to get to Nachmanides, and there I'll finish, and we're going to open the discussion for some questions. What's the stake in the argument? On the one hand, what's attractive about the Gaonic view is that you anchor all of Halacha, all of its details in Revelation. Everything was given at Sinai, everything. Even at what exact time of Kriyat Shema or Shel Arvit or Shacharit. Everything. But if this is the case, then you have to account how is it that there are controversies. And then, in order to anchor everything in Revelation, you undermine the authenticity of tradition. Right? Because you have to say, well, some material was lost. So you say, well, only details, but the rest of tradition really was kept intact. Now, the trade-off for Maimonides is different, because Maimonides keeps intact tradition. He says, whatever received in Simon was kept. You cannot put blemish on the rabbis that they forgot what was given to them by God through their own teachers. So, but So when does controversy emerge? When rabbis, through their own innovative force, begin to add details to halacha, then controversy emerges. Now, you are shrinking the scope of controversy to save the authenticity of tradition. Well, Maimonides is not that much of a problem because he thinks that reason can create normative commitments, divine almost normative commitments. Now we get to Ramban, Moshe ben Nachman's theory of halacha. And I want to quote here, I'm quoting one of his students, you know that one of the greatest things about Ramban, Nachmanides, is that he was, all of the Rishonim of Catalonia, Rashi, Rashba, Ran, Ritva, they're all students of Nachmanides. And I'm now quoting from the Ritva's Chidushim, Chidusha Ritva on Masechet Eruvin, Yud Gimel, Daf Yud Gimel Amud Bet. And the Ritva poses the following question. שאלו רבני צרפת, בתוספות, איך אפשר שיהיו שניהם דברי אלוהים חיים? He asks the following. How could it be the case when there is a debate that both sides are, he asks about the Gemara that says, Elu va'elu divrei Elohim chaim, these and these are the words of God. And he asks, how is it possible that these and these are the words of God? וזה אוסר וזה מתיר, this prohibits and that permits. ותרצו, and they answer, כי כשעלה משה למרום לקבל תורה, when Moshe came to heaven to receive the Torah, הראו לו על כל דבר ודבר ממתת פנים לאיסור וממתת פנים להיתר. They showed him about every halacha, 49 reasons for permitting, 49 reasons for prohibiting. ושאל הקדוש ברוך הוא על זה, and Moshe says, so what do we do about it? ואמר שיהיה מסור לחכמי ישראל שבכל דור ודור, ויהיה הכרעה כמותם, ונכון הוא לפי הדרש, ובדרך האמת יש טעם סוד בדבר. This is the approach of the school of Ramban, and I want to say a few things about this approach and finish my presentation. What does this approach say? Challenging, by the way, all aspects of Maimonides' philosophy of halacha. Revelation. In revelation, all Torah is given, including the controversies. Controversy, unlike what the Gaonim thought, that is an accident, or unlike what Maimonides thought, that it begins when the human element begins to interpret Torah and innovate, controversy is milechatchila part and parcel of the nature of revelation itself. The Torah was given in a multi-facet way. So there is a difference about controversy. There is also a difference about revelation. And there is also a difference about truth. Because according to this view, when you have machloket, no side is actually wrong. Because both sides are anchored in God's multi-faceted revelation. Interpretation is not about restoring knowledge. It's not about adding new halachot. Interpretation is constitutive. It's about constituting meaning out of many options that are legitimate in Torah itself. By the way, it's interesting. When the Ritva presents, so let's take the first controversy in the Mishnah. ממתי קוראים את שמע בערבית? The first controversy in the Mishnah. When do we read the Shema in the evening? According to Geonim, we have three views about this controversy. According to Geonim, Hashem said to Moshe, בשוכבך, and then he says to him orally, I mean, עד סוף השמורה הראשונה, till the first third of the day, of the evening. That's the view, or he said something. He gave the detailed time. It was part of revelation. According to Rambam, he said only בשוכבך. If he would have said orally at time, we wouldn't have any controversy. When Chachamim begin to add, they want to know now not only the general idea of בשוכבך, but the actual time, and they begin to interpret, controversy begins. According to Ramban, Ritva, and his school, when God gave Torah, he says to Moshe Rabbeinu בשוכבך, and he gave him 49 reasons why it is all night and why it is third of the night, the first third. And then Moshe asked, so what do we do? And HaKadosh Baruch said, you should interpret the Torah. It's yours to decide. So we have three views of Halacha. I call them the following. One is restorative. All Halacha was given. The other one is accumulative. The Rambam's view. Halacha accumulates through time. And the third one is constitutive. What do I mean? The Perush, the interpretation, is such that it constitutes meaning. It constitutes meaning through multiplicity of options that are legitimated in revelation itself through its giving. So what do we see, by the way? Here's actually an interesting encounter between three views of Halacha, one presented by the Geonim, the other one presented by the Rambam, and the other one presented by Ramban. Let me stop here. This really. I see that there is a question about the sources. I will send the sources. I will send the sources to all the Chavura and the participants. One is the introduction of, as I said, one is the introduction of Avraham ibn Daud to Sefer Kabbalah. The other one is Maimonides' words and statements in Akdama lePerush HaMishnah. And the third one is Ritva, Chidusha Ritva leEruvin Yud Gimel Amud Bet. Three very different views of all of Halacha, which theologically, religiously, really touch about the foundations of our thinking of what Halacha is. So let's take some questions. Anybody wants to ask? I see some questions over the chat, but I'm not good at reading the chat and talking to people simultaneously. I am of this old generation.
First of all,
why don't you raise your hand and ask?
Yeah, I think that would be best if they either want to raise their hand. I want to, first of all, Professor, say that I don't want you to stop. It's been tremendously exciting and wonderful to hear you and to hear the presentation. Thank you so much again for taking the time to share with us. But yes, if anyone has any questions, you can either raise your hand or, virtually. Okay. So we have Sam.
I see Sam.
Sam, where's Sam? Sam, there you are, Sam. All right, Sam has a question. I will ask you to unmute, and you can unmute and ask your question.
Hello, Professor. Firstly, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I just have one question. How do the Gaonim, the Ramban, and the Rambam, how do they know what they're saying? What are they basing themselves on?
Well, you see, it's interesting. Ritva bases itself on a Gemara, right? Elu va'elu divrei Elohim chaim. These and these are the words of God. By the way, this statement, Elu va'elu divrei chaim, never quoted in all of Rambam's corpus. I mean, this is a risky statement to make, but as far as I know, Moshe ben Maimonides never quotes this Gemara. Now, Geonim have their sources in a different view of controversy in Sanhedrin, in the Tosefta, says, Misherabu talmidei Shammai והלל שלא שימשו כל צורכם. בראשונה לא הייתה מחלוקת בישראל, משרבו תלמידי שמאי והלל שלא שימשו כל צורכם, נעשתה תורה רבו מחלוקות בישראל, נעשתה תורה כשתי תורות. So they have their own source of the understanding of controversy, which Maimonides reads it in a completely different way. So basically what happened is, if you look carefully, there is controversy already in the Talmud about why there is controversy, and they develop different approaches through those voices into a full-fledged philosophical point of view. Yes.
Thank you. Sam, you have a follow-up?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so my question is like, okay, so I understand that they have their sources, and obviously the Ritva and the Ramban are privileging Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chaim over the Tosefta, but my question is, why have they chosen that interpretation? How do they know that their interpretation is correct? As in, why are the Gaonim privileging Shelo Shimshu Kol Tzorkam?
I'll tell you why. Because the thrust is deeply theological. What drives the Gaonim? It's also connected to the anti-Karaite debate, but that's on the side of it. But what's the thrust? Theologically, by the way, you hear today as well people who think this way theologically. You want to anchor all of Halacha in God's words, right? After all, most of Halacha is not directly Torah shebichtav, right? But you want to say, when I do a mitzvah, I'm obeying God's word, God's will. So there is an attempt to include all of Halacha at Sinai. That's the thrust. Now, the trade-off, and it's complicated. If all of Halacha is Sinai, why are you arguing all the time? It's a tough question. You say, well, we forgot some stuff. You forgetting? Are you crazy? No, just the minor issues. Some students weren't on Zoom, I don't know. Rambam wants to keep a steady kernel of Halacha untouched. Whatever was given in Revelation is untouched. You cannot say it was given and forgotten. But theologically, he understands that human reason is part of the creative religious force in creation of Halacha. By the way, the Rambam is the first one to say, in the history of Halacha post-Talmudic, that Chachamim chidshu halachot midaatam. And that's where controversy enters. Why he doesn't mind theologically doing that? It's because he thinks that reason has the power to create norms that are religiously obligated. He has no problem to say, Chachamim, through interpretation, accumulated laws, halachot. So there is a theological debate between them. Now, when we go to Ramban, that's where you have Kabbalah. Perceiving, since there is already a certain type of plurality within divinity, and I don't want to get to Ramban's concept of Torah, which is very powerful and interesting, Kabbalistically speaking. You can imagine someone claiming that the Torah itself is multifaceted in the way The divine world is multi-faced. So what you have is large theological thinking that have a large impact on the foundations of philosophy of halacha, of different trends within Jewish medieval world.
Thank you. Rav Shmuley Phillips, you have a question. I'll ask you to unmute. Here you are.
Hi. Can you hear me?
You hear you, yeah.
Hi. Thank you. First of all, thank you very much. Question: when we talk about the opinion of the Gaonim, does that mean they were all united in this approach? So to speak, that all the Gaonim for all these centuries had a certain approach to Machloket, and suddenly Rambam's coming along and changing it, or there was some level of dispute even going back in the period of the Gaonim, which...
Well, I would say the following. It's mostly unanimous. I mean, there are variations between Rav Sadia Gaon, Rav Shrira Gaon. There are variations, but it's mostly unanimous. And it's based on the following idea. It's based on the idea that all Torah Sheba'al Peh is a received tradition. It's mostly unanimous. And the Rambam breaks with the Gaonic tradition completely.
That's a very major break at that stage.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. By the way, it's not the only break that he makes with Gaonim. And by the way, one source of the clash between Nachmanides and the Rambam is Nachmanides is a defender of the Gaonic tradition. Many, many times. And he writes Sefer HaMitzvot, Hasagot Sefer HaMitzvot, because Maimonides' beginning of the Hasagot is a fierce attack on Baal Halachot Gdolot, one of the greatest Gaonim, Rabbi Shimon Karaya. And Nachmanides is furious with the relationship of Maimonides to Gaonim, furious. By the way, I just want to say, and this is by way of just beginning a new thought. For Maimonides, the Rif is a new era in relationship to the Gaonim. Yeah. That's the way Maimonides view the Rif. For Nachmanides, the Rif is the Batrai of the Gaonim. Is the kind of culmination of the Gaonic world. And this is why for Nachmanides, defending the Rif is defending the whole tradition prior to the Rif. So there is a whole clash of the relationship to the Gaonim. By the way, Maimonides in the introduction to the Mishnah Torah said that he doesn't accept Gaonic authority. Yeah. And when the Mishnah Torah gets to Baghdad, where the Gaonim, the heirs of Gaonim are seated, it's not well received. Not at all. Not at all. Huge clash.
Thank you.
So there is
from would have learned in the way of the Gaonim, and the Rambam changed from that?
Well, I'll tell you the following. If we want to think about Andalusia, it goes the following. And this is a historical point of view. All of Sepharad begins from Bavel, right? What you have is Jews are following Islamic conquest of the Maghreb and Spain, right? Jews are following the Muslims, right? And they from the center in Bavel, they spread through North Africa, entering south of Spain, right? That's the root of the Jews. So the mother community is in Baghdad, right? That's the mother community. But as we know many times, the grandchildren begin to be greater than the mother community, and the mother community still think itself as the grand community. Now, the achievements of Andalus are shadowing what was going on in Baghdad. And for them, it's like, okay, so there is a whole complex relationship. Now, the Baghdadis still think we are Beit Din HaGadol, we sit on the seat of Ravashi and Ravami.
It's not stam that the Rambam signed his name Hasfaradi for his whole life.
All the time. Even when he's in Egypt.
Yeah.
Even in Egypt, years and years, he will call himself Hasfaradi. All the time. All the time.
Yeah. A question from Rabbi Kada. ask you to unmute.
Thank you very much, Professor Halbertal, for fascinating shiur. On the opinion of the Rambam, I have 3 questions. Rambam, Maimon. Firstly, Bishlam, according to the Gaonim, I can understand what the Nevi'im were doing. They already had the details of the halacha, which was all given in Sinai. And as time went on, then people forgot things. According to Rambam, that really no detail was given until the Chachamim and the Mishnah decided to debate it. You know, what was happening for the last 1500 years until then? You know, when were they saying Kriyat Shema, Sof Zaman, Shah, the 3 hours? But what was going on during all that time? That's number one. Number two is, according to the Rambam, how does he explain the Gemara in Shabbat, in Rishonim Kemalachim, you know, the concept at least of Yeridat HaDorot from that Gemara. And third question, how does he explain the Gemara? Misharabu Machlok Talmidim Shloshim Shukot Tzorkam. How does he actually explain that?
Okay, so let's start with the third question, because about that we have a particular address of Rambam himself. The other questions we just try to speculate. Rambam says, what is Sheloshim Shukot Tzorkam? It's not that they lost given positive traditions. They didn't trade themselves well in legal argument and legal logic. They were just jurisprudentially bad. Because if they were well trained in argumentation, they would reach more or less the same conclusions. Because people who have good way of reasoning, at least that's what the Rambam thinks, they have thorough ways of reasoning, debating with one another, arguing, counter-arguments, etc. They're gonna reach a consensus. And the problem with the Talmidei Shammai v'Hillel, that their mode of argumentation was weak. Not that they have, for him, God forbid, that they've forgotten received traditions from Sinai. That's something Rambam is not willing to accept. Theologically, in his relationship to tradition, it's so that's his approach. Now, the Rambam does think that there is a Yeridat HaDorot to a certain degree. It doesn't apply, but it's not a complete logic of history. It doesn't go in one slope. There are ups and downs, etc., etc. His vision of history is complicated. And clearly, he wouldn't posit himself as a chamor in light of the Gaonim, that they were Bnei Adam, not at all. His own self-perception is... Now, you have to remember, I want to tell you something about the Rambam. The Rambam is an immigrant. Most of his life is an immigrant. He's an immigrant from a great culture, right? He comes from a great culture, Andalus. And he doesn't think himself or his world as kind of historically inferior to prior generations. He thinks about his world as a kind of a summit that has to be preserved and lost. By the way, all the great Jewish codes are written by immigrants. That's true about the Mishnah Torah, it's true about Shulchan Aruch. Rabbi Yosef Karo is an immigrant. Here's another Sepharadi, expelled, not by the Al-Mukhadin, but by the Christians, right? We have to remember, Rabbi Yosef Karo is a heir of a lost tradition. Codification, in many ways, is an attempt of preserving a lost world by immigrants. Now, the first question is, what have they done? They've done different things. We don't know what they've done. Could be this way, could be that way. But unlike the rabbis, they had conventions. They didn't have arguments. They might have different conventions. This should this way, this should that way. But it wasn't solidified in an interpretive attempt to figure out interpretively what Torah meant. And therefore, they didn't establish halacha. Halacha was established only by the Tanaim. They might have different, modes they did it. At 7:30, when they came from here, when they came from there, there wasn't real halacha in that respect. There was a minhag.
Okay. Thank you. Rav Elisha, you have a question.
Thank you very much, Professor. Two questions. First of all, is there any evidence that the occupations of the Rambam and the Ramban as physicians had any bearing on their hashkafa and worldview, or vice versa? That's the first question. Second
Imagine
question.
you asking that for any particular reason.
And the second question is, do you believe, personally, I know there were some commentators and many Sepharim have been written that the Rambam did study Kabbalah. There's some evidence of that he did study Kabbalah in the Mishnah Torah. Do you believe that he was familiar with Kabbalah? Obviously, Zohar wasn't available in the format that we have it, but do you believe that the Rambam was exposed to Kabbalah or not?
Well, let's start with this second question. I don't think the Rambam was exposed to the Kabbalah as medieval Kabbalah. He knew Sefer Shiur Koma, which in earlier versions of Perush HaMishnah, he tended to interpret it allegorically, and later version he rejects it as a complete heresy, etc., etc. But he didn't know the Kabbalah of Sfirot. There was no hint of his knowledge. And his conceptions of unity are so strict that if we would have encountered the Kabbalah of Sfirot, especially if they think Atzmut, not Kelim, the different versions of Kabbalah, but that would have been a real. He would make you know that he knows by denouncing it.
That's a wonderful point. I have to say, not that I'm saying in Machriya Dvarav Chas v'Shalom, but he would make you know that he knows by denouncing it.
But there are no, not that I know of any hints that we have students of his encountering it, By the way, it's interesting because there is a comment on the Rivash in the name of the Ran, right? Rivash is a student of the Ran, and there is a comment on Rivash in the name of the Ran that says, "V'yoter midai shika atzmo b'Kabbalah hi." A critique of Nachmanides being a Kabbalist by his own student. So that's one important thing. Now, being physicians, right? Here are true physicians, good, both of them, by the way, very close to the authorities. It's interesting. The Rambam was the physician of the Grand Vizier of Salah ad-Din, right? He was very close to the court. And the Ramban, Moshe ben Nachman, also was a physician of the court, very close to the Jaime, the king of Aragon, right? The debate with the Christians, the great debate, Pulmusa Ramban, was in front of the king, and the king claimed that Ramban won the argument. So that also gave them some political relation with authorities. But Ramban had a more ambivalent view of medicine. And that has to do with his theory of bitachon, etc.
Very famously, he said in that one should not go to doctors if there's a lack in emunah. And also the Ramban never published anything. He didn't write any medical books, whereas the Rambam wrote over 40.
Sure, huge medical work. And they also belong to different medical traditions. But I think it would be interesting to see Ramban's view of medicine, the religious engagement in medicine per se. But that's a very interesting relation and complex attitude towards their own profession that they both had.
Okay. Professor, do we have time for two more questions, or we?
Sure, we have time, sure.
All right. So, question from Jack.
Yeah, hi, Professor. Thank you very much. It's so much knowledge and so much breadth and such great analysis. It's really amazing and intimidating. Just to pull it back a little bit, I was just wondering if you could talk a bit about how psak halacha, or deciding, being machriya and machloket, would work for the different views that you put out for the Gaonim, for the Rambam, for the Ramban. Yeah.
Right. So it's a very interesting question. I would say the following. If you are in the view of the Gaonim, and you have a theory of truth, and there is a machloket, and you say truth is what was given at Sinai, and we're trying to figure out what actually was given since we forgot it, you will tend to go lechumra, right? Because the price of mistake is missing on what actually God said, right? Now, according to Ramban in Psak, and Ramban has this term that he uses both in his Asagot LeSefer HaMitzvot and in his interpretation of Torah, Al Da'at Chachamim Nitna Torah. According to the opinion of the Rabbi, when he interprets the Isur, Lo Tasur Mimeno Yamin U'Smol, Afilu Omrim Lecha Al Yamin Shu Smol V'Al Smol Shal Yamin, Al Da'at Chachamim Nitna Torah. Basically, the Rambam, Nachmanides' view is Psak could never be wrong. It's kind of a radical view, because when the Beit Din decides, the Beit Din constitutes the very meaning of Torah. It doesn't have prior authoritative meaning before the Beit Din actually ruled this rule. I mean, talking about Sanhedrin, right? Lo tasur min hadavar she'omer v'elecha, al da'at chachamim nitna Torah. He says it. Why? Because in some ways, because all opinions are legitimate, they constitute halacha through their psak. Now, Rambam, by the way, in Ilchot Mamrim, says something very radical. He says that Beit Din Katan can argue against the prior Beit Din Gadol if it's a matter of svara. It's actually very powerful. He says the rule that Beit Din, that the future small Beit Din cannot argue with the past great Beit Din is only on matters of takanot, of enactment, but not interpretations. So we have all the three approaches have deep implications about what do we mean by psak. And you should study that chapter, Perek Bet Milchot Mamrim, is a very important chapter, where Maimonides says, hierarchical relationships between Batei Dinim has to do when those Batei Dinim are issuing enactments, which come from their own authority. But if they reason, then a small court in the future can say we have a different reason.
Thank you. And finally, Robert Sassoon for our last question tonight.
Yes, I'd like to reiterate everybody's comments that it's been a fascinating talk, but I'd like to ask the Professor to elucidate a little bit more on the opinion of the Ramban. So I can understand the opinion of the Gaonim, and I understand the opinion of Rambam, but the Ramban, why is it attractive to him to say that Moshe Rabbeinu received this multifaceted Torah with all the, if you like, the machloket of the Gemara actually in the Torah? What sort of worldview does that enable for him? Because I guess the other views are much simpler and easier, perhaps of my limited understanding. But I'm really struggling to understand what motivates him to say that. It's almost a bit like Lo Aleni, some people say that, you know, Hashem buried the dinosaurs here just to confuse us, right? So why did he give us, from the view of the Ramban, why does he give us these machlokets as being effectively divine?
Good. By the way, all your questions are wonderful, and thank you. This is as well a very wonderful question. I want to say the following. That has to do with understanding Ramban's view of revelation. Because I'm going to say something radical, but in order to ground it, we're going to have to read Ramban's introduction to his Perush Torah and other texts. We think of revelation, I mean, in a simple manner, as a message given by God to humans, right? A book or a statement, etc. For the Ramban, following the Kabbalists, revelation is not a message given to God, it's God's own self-revelation, right? Kutchabrichu v'Torah, there is almost a unity. It's the way, if I want to give you a metaphor, and it's only a metaphor, it's the way you read me when you see my face with hundreds of, dozens of facial muscles, and I express myself in different ways through my face. I've kind of revealed myself to you. So the Torah is God's own face, by way of analogy. Now, if God is infinite and the Torah is infinite, what your reading of the Torah only scratches a very small potential meaning of that world called Torah, right? Not only that, by the way, Maimonides says in the beginning of the commentary of the Torah, a Torah is the names of God. The original Ur Torah is a chain of God's names, which means it is God's own self-revelation. And if you begin to think of Torah this way, you're going to get closer to what he thinks, right? Because revelation then is an all-encompassing wisdom that whatever you take of it is just an aspect you carve through human encounter with that divine corpus. And that's now, since it engages multiplicity, you can imagine. By the way, I just want to say, most Kabbalists, the Kabbalists are the most pluralist about controversy, because they always can anchor controversy in God's own self-multiplicity. You know, that comes from Din, from Chesed, etc., etc., etc. So if you think about Torah this way, you're going to begin to, if not agreeing, at least sensing the gestalt in which, the theological gestalt, the religious gestalt, where this can be embedded.
Thank you. Professor? I can say pretty confidently that everybody will be sleeping with the malachim tonight, with the angels tonight, after a discussion like that. We are so honored, and so, I know I speak on behalf of everyone here, that we are so honored and so grateful that you took the time to share such wonderful thought, enlightening and inspiring ideas and thought for us tonight, which I can say personally, it inspires my own Torah, my own identity, and my own joy and commitment to our derech li'ud. Thank you for the work that you do, and thank you for the study that you do. And so I want to say to everyone, please pay close attention. The professor's new book on the Ramban, Nachmanides' Law and Mysticism, is available now for pre-order on Amazon, and it is launching on 27th October. I, for one, cannot wait to read it and get my hands on it. And I will ask you, Professor, for a hadgasha when I get a chance to see you, please God, in person very soon when we're able to. I want to thank everyone for being here tonight and for taking part. I know many people had other questions, but these are discussions, and these questions will carry on with B'ezrat Hashem in the Bet Midrash together. We look forward.
And thank you. It's an honor. Thank you for having me, and really thank you for the questions. Really, I've learned a lot from the questions. So
thank you, Professor.
That's the heart to all of you.
Amen, amen. And to you, and we look forward to more, please God, in the future.
Amen, amen.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.